For the next session, it is a roundtable on the 2019 recommendations on higher education. Hang on, when Dr. Mazli, when Dr. Mazli began his tenure as minister, he was aware and was constantly reminded by academics and vociferous student groups that the Universities and University Colleges Act needed to go. More than that, a whole slew of reforms was needed to address the rot that had set in over decades. Numerous committees were set up and consultants invited to come up with a roadmap for reform. The three individuals on this roundtable were key members of that group of independent consultants. Today, they will highlight, I believe, what they set out to do, how it was received, and what has happened to the extensive studies they conducted and compile. I'll briefly introduce them to you. Mr. UK Menon is a law teacher whose experience spans over 30 years in 3 countries. He helped set up and develop, at that point in time, ITM's law program to international recognition as a professional qualification in law. He was at different times Director of Studies and Group CEO of Stanford College and Deputy Vice Chancellor, Strategy and Planning at Wawasan Open University, and Associate Director with the University of Melbourne's Asian Law Centre. Mr. Menon was a member of several committees established by the Ministry of Education to review policies and laws governing higher education. Dr. Wang Chanda is the Deputy Director and a Senior Lecturer at the National Higher Education Research Institute at USM, University of Science Malaysia. He has been involved in several research and consultancy projects, including those with UNESCO, OECD, and the Commonwealth Tertiary Education Facility. He is also a life member of the Malaysian Society for Higher Education Policy and Research Development, or Pendapat. Dr. Rozilini Fernandez-Chung is the Director of the Centre for Academic Partnerships and Engagement, or CAPE, at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and is an Associate Professor in the School of Education. She established the Malaysian Higher Education Quality Assurance System, and as an international QA specialist, she established this quality assurance system for higher education in Bangladesh and continues to contribute to global quality assurance and higher education policy in many developing countries.
Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chang from IPPTN USM. Thank you for this opportunity to share what we have gone through over the last 2 years with my team of very eminent, and in fact, I'm the most junior of all, very eminent academics in various areas, people who are well versed with the legislation on higher education, who has been involved in numerous committees that has amended the amendment to AUKU and also to Act 555. And we also have people who have been working for a long time in various aspects of governance of higher education. Dr. Rozilini, with her experience from MQA, and also 2 other members who are here in this webinar, but not in the roundtable. I also want to acknowledge them, Professor Nozani and also Mr. Suhaimi. He's actually Professor Nozani is a professor in UKM who specializes on academic profession, issues of professionalism within academia. And Mr. Suhaimi is actually a civil servant with vast experience in the Ministry of Higher Education in various capacity. So we are actually a team of 12 people. Let me get the screen as we speak. Can you see the screen? Yep.
Yes.
No, thank you. So we are actually a group of 12 people, and the project that was commissioned to us was actually parked in the National Higher Education Research Institute, and I'm merely taking the role of coordinator to coordinate these various aspects of people, because the call given to us was rather interesting. We were not given the task to just amend or to abolish AUKU, but the task given to us was actually to harmonize the various laws in higher education, because there was actually another committee that was looking specifically into AUKU, and that was chaired by the Director General herself at that time. So our group was actually looking. The first mandate given to us was to look at how the laws can be harmonized. When we say the laws here, we're referring to AUKU, to Act 555, but actually there are 8 other laws that in one way or another relates to higher education and the running of the universities, both public and private. Some of them includes the MQA Act. UITM has its own set of legislation. The Act 605 that Dr. Masdi has talked a little bit about, and things like that. And together with the harmonizing of the law itself, is also to look into the strengthening of the governance systems, because this needs to go hand in hand, because the law actually prescribes a lot of what is happening at the governance level. And one of the reasons why we have to take this very vast approach was because if we go back to the mandate or the mandate given to the team, or the aspiration of the government at that point, was not just to abolish AUKU, but to also restore some of the fundamental principles of academia, that is academic freedom and also institutional autonomy. And as we begin that work, we realize that that cannot happen by just abolishing AUKU and replacing with another piece of legislation. Because the whole issue of academic freedom, of institutional autonomy, are very much tied and intertwined with many different aspects of higher education, not only in terms of the legislation, but importantly, it has a vast implication to the funding of universities. In our context at the moment, it's more to the public universities, but that whole funding arrangement actually has a very close relation to how the status of autonomy is being understood within the civil service and within the government at this point. And also closely related to that, academic freedom has also got to do with the status of the academic profession and the need of a sort of agile governance systems to accommodate and to connect these various different aspects of higher education, right? So, and therefore the team actually came up not only with a draft of or a legal framework that allowed the drafters to draft the new Higher Education Act. We actually came up with 6 policy papers that is more of a reform proposal rather than just a new draft of a new legislation to higher education. So my colleagues will talk a little bit more specific into some of this policy papers, aspect of these policy papers. So essentially the 6 aspects that we have covered is on the governance of the system, and we also very briefly talk about a new introduction of a new entity called the Ombudsman. We also address the issue of academic professions, the issue of the need for professionalism and the recognition of status of an academic within the university. The issue of funding, we also talk about how funding should be changed and should be reformed, and coming closely together with the whole funding issue is also the service level agreement, which is something new to the system that we have sort of thrown the idea out to, that it should go hand in hand with the whole funding arrangement. And lastly, also to look at what will happen to the universities, both public and private, right? The changes at the system level, finally, what would that entail to the actual status of the university? So these are interconnected areas. So my colleagues will talk about this a little bit more in each of this session. But overall, what we were doing in the last 1 year or so was really looking at, it was a 2-pronged strategy that we were looking at, both at the reform of the system and at the same time working to develop the legal framework that will capture what we want. So the guiding we were guided by these guiding principles that we have outlined right at the beginning, what we think the higher education system and institution should have. So these are the guiding principles that guided the way we look at the various issues and aspects of higher education. And that becomes the guiding principles for us as we propose changes and reforms that should be looked at. So the first principle is we believe that higher education should be a national agenda, should be a critical agenda of the government for the development of Malaysia. We also discussed the role of the state here. In the state is not the individual states, that we have the 14 states, but this is the state of Malaysia as a whole, the nation. What is the role of the nation in that regard? And we will strongly detach that, whereby the role of the government is only a mere political representation of the aspiration of the state through the representation of the people. So the role of the state here, as Dr. Mazdi has talked about earlier, from being currently a very tight controller that is running a lot of things, to gradually reduce the role of the state, the ministry, into the role of a policymaker and a regulator. And we believe that in this current situation, where there's a lot of disruption, and even before this disruption comes about, things are very dynamic out there, and the higher education system needs to be agile to address the system. And how can we put in place a governance structure that allows that agility to happen? And Malaysia is actually blessed with a diversity of institutions. We have talked a little bit about TVET, some of the comments earlier, and these are some of the diversity within the systems that we need to preserve, and we need to further enhance that. Each university should be unique, serving different needs of different pockets of society that comes together collectively to build the system. And we should not just have one kind of universities, everyone trying to go to be a research university, to go for ranking and so on. So the diversity of institution is what our team believe to be very important in a healthy higher education system, and that needs to be preserved. And the three other principles I think we are all very familiar with is the institutional autonomy must be respected, and at the same time, institutional accountability needs to be put in place. That's where the service level agreement is one of the examples that we have talked about. And last but not least, the whole academic freedom is that principles that we want to see at the end of this. And that can only happen if institutions has autonomy, the system is guided by principles of where we are going. And I would then now pass the time to my colleague, Rozilini, to take us through the second part of this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Changda. Rom, good morning, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here today, and I thank Gorak and Aspet for their initiative to put this together. I think it's really important that we know what's happening, and hopefully something will pick up after this particular session. Now, I'll go straight on to what I would like to say today. So as mentioned by Dr. Changda, one of the overarching terms of reference for the panel or the team was to review higher education governance structure. So it is very good to note from the offset that Malaysia is not unique in wanting to change our governance structure. In fact, when we did the study, we were able to actually access various countries that has actually updated the higher education structure in recent times, as near as 2 years ago, or as far back as 7 years ago. And we also had looked at many of these governance structure in coming up with what we think would be the best for the country. However, I think there are still many globally today who is still contemplating or reviewing the higher education structure, which, having done this, I think it's a Herculean task. It's really not an easy thing to do. It is not about developing or taking something that happens in another country and placing it in Malaysia. because that will not work for us. It was really something about getting the best practices out and putting them together and matching them to the needs, both short-term, long-term, medium and long-term of the country. Yeah. So the team spent significant time at the start of the study to understand, first and foremost, the gaps and opportunities of the current higher education governance structure in Malaysia. I think we were sincere and honest about what were the gaps. We were open about the gaps, and I think that was really a very good start to getting this in place. So we concluded, after all the discussions and debates, I would think, nobody threw any chairs though, but nonetheless the debates were really strong debates and arguments. We wanted to get the right thing done for the country. That kind of bind us together, the fact that all of us, the 12 in the team, wanted what was best for Malaysia. And I think that was a really good start. So these were the conclusions that we made at the first start of after discussing the various aspects, that the new structure should, among others, be sufficiently agile to support a fast-growing sector. Because in Malaysia, higher education has always been a fast-growing sector. Number two, it should allow for better connectivity and seamless collaboration between bodies overseeing the various functions within the higher education sector. For example, PTPTN or MQA or Ministry of Higher Education, and so forth and so on. Yeah. Well, technically, this means we want to reduce what we sometimes call softly a very soft inter-agency competition. So we wanted to reduce that. We want agencies or bodies working within the higher education sector to have a little bit more connectivity and collaboration. Thirdly, we wanted a structure that would become the enabler for greater coordination between the various parts. Well, it's interconnected to number two. Within the structure to allow for greater speed and quality of service to stakeholders. I think this is sometimes very lacking. And if you have, all of us are familiar with the delays that happens in the system. I can give you one good example of sending an email to, say, for example, the Ministry of Higher Education. It probably takes about 3 to 4 months to get a response to that email. This is a common problem. And this is not because the people in the ministry are not working, but because they have to connect with, having been in the ministry, MQA before, I know how it works. It is the need for the ministry to connect with the various bodies within the whole sector in order to give a proper answer. So that's the biggest challenge. So the need for coordination is really to allow for speed and better quality of service. Fourthly, to allow the new structure, we wanted the new structure to lock in institutional autonomy. And I think that was crucial. That probably was our priority, perhaps, if you want, But at the same time, we wanted to ensure there is institutional accountability. You cannot have autonomy without accountability. And we were very clear about this from the very beginning. And of course, finally, we felt that whatever structure that we propose, the structure must function effectively and support higher education Malaysia to grow irrespective of the varying financing model that exists within the structure today. And by this, I mean not just public or private. I'm also thinking about for-profit and not-for-profit institutions within the sector. It must, as you will soon hear later on in the section, be able to allow higher education sector to be a sustainable, I know many don't like this word, industry, sustainable sector, because within the environment that we are in, we know that one thing that is quite certain is the declining public funding. So no matter what happens, the system or the structure that we propose must be able to sustain the growth of higher education sector within an environment with declining public funding. So these were our 5, I would say, fundamentals. I wouldn't say guiding principles. The fundamentals that we developed at the very early stage of our study into governance. And then with the above in mind, we set out to consider what were the best practices that we had globally from numerous countries that are viewed globally as education giants. So we didn't really look at only developing countries that kind of fit Malaysian environment, but we also looked at countries that has gone way ahead of us, who are leaps and bounds ahead of Malaysia in relation to higher education and internationalization of higher education. But we also, in that quest, looked at some of the lesser known, but nonetheless, very new and innovative governance structure with countries that may not be very popular for education and internationalization, but nonetheless is known to have good education systems. After many months of deliberation, as I said, many drafts, debates, we came to a conclusion, given the uniqueness of Malaysian higher education sector, our history, our environment, our current challenges, and the need for a governance structure that is uniquely Malaysia. And I think that's really very important for us, using best practices from various jurisdictions. So we came up with this structure that we think is unique. We know, we are confident, is uniquely Malaysian. The proposal is not just about making a fundamental shift in governance. We also need a governance structure that meets our current, medium, and long-term needs, and at the same time, allow us to maximize the opportunities available to make Malaysian higher education truly Malaysian and outstandingly global. So if you now look at the picture that is in front of you, or the graph that is in front of you, allow me a few minutes to just elaborate this very quickly. Now, this structure basically is the whole structure that we think the new higher education sector should take. So at the very top of the structure sits the minister, who represents or who works or functions as an advisory person, and to whom all reports are submitted. So he oversees and he works as an advisory, he has an advisory role to the overall higher education sector. And of course, he supports the element of policy making, which basically it's held by the buffer organization. So when we had this concept of a buffer organization, basically to remove what we call the politicization of higher education, to remove this concept that whatever happens in higher education is because of politics. And I think we should make that distinction very clear. So the buffer body works as a coordinating body that looks into the various aspects that are currently already being done by the different organizations. So nothing is going to, somebody just sent a message saying, I can't hear you. Can the rest of you hear me?
Very well.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, thank you. So I just moved my thing a little bit closer. So the buffer body, sorry, just lost my thought now. Thank you all. So the buffer body actually works as a coordinating body that takes care of what we understand today as PTPTN, MQA. They will exist as their own individual agencies or bodies, but all the activities will be coordinated by this buffer body. So the buffer body is like, if you want, like the ministry now overseeing the whole activity, yeah? So we have divided the roles or the various functions of the higher education into 5 major areas: funding and financing for students, accreditation and quality assurance, registrar for institutions and academics, academic research and development, and internationalization and student mobility. Now, so these would actually be, as I said, coordinated by the buffer body, and the buffer body works together with the higher education institutions for the benefit of 3 things, we think: staff, student, and curriculum. Now, if there are any concerns, any challenges, any elements of, any issues that crop up between these stakeholders, the matters will be resolved at the Ombudsman rather than an open court, as currently can happen. So again, later on, Mr. Menon will take us a little bit further on the concept of Ombudsman. So at this point, I will stop here and I'll leave some time and some avenue for you to raise your questions. I would like to go on to the next slide, which I think Changda is controlling. Thank you, Changda. Right. So as you can see, there are many enablers within the proposed structure. We cannot have a structure without enablers being put in. So these enablers would allow us to achieve our vision of having an outstanding higher education sector. But let me talk about 2 enablers that is quite crucial to the higher education sector. The first one is the funding formula. Now, our proposal is to move away from a one-line budget that funds operation of public universities to what we call a formulated funding mechanism using per student funding and performance-based funding. So there are two funding mechanisms rather than just, I give you X amount of money and this is for your operations. So it's going to be a student-based funding as well as performance-based funding. For many of us who are familiar with the UK higher education sector, this is not new. This has been in the UK sector for many, many years, and it works relatively well. Yeah. The other one that we have used, the other enabler we used for financial autonomy is what Chang mentioned just now, this new concept of service level agreement. Again, this is not something new globally. There are many higher education jurisdictions that uses service level agreement. And the biggest concern, I would think, why we need this, right? The biggest concern that underlines all discussions on autonomy and funding, particularly if it involves direct or indirect public funding, is accountability. How do you know that by giving the autonomy, the universities are using the money properly or for the purpose they're supposed to use? So the proposed new structure actually recommends the incorporation of service level agreements between all higher education institutions and the government, which clearly provides for the responsibilities and liabilities of the parties to the contract. And if you look at the PowerPoint or the slide in front of you, I'll take you back to the funding formula. If you go to the per student funding, it kind of explains to you how this would work. So it's input-based, 3-year cycle, 3 or 4-year cycle, depending, I would think. Transparent formula developed by the buffer body only for the public universities. Yeah. So the public universities then, we recommend, will have the autonomy to adjust its structure and resources according to the funding under the authority of its own governance board. Whereas performance-based funding and agenda, it's on a needs-based, it's a policy lever, it's a competitive bidding. We can use these kind of operational formulas to actually ensure funding reaches the right university for the right purpose. Whereas when you talk about service level agreements, some clarification is given in the slides itself. So the service level agreement would outline details of educational services to the universities that the universities will render to the state. So it's a simple quid pro quo kind of arrangement. I think I got that pronunciation wrong, but never mind. It's really about, I give you something in return for something. So if I give you X amount of money, if I give you 10 million, you should train me X number of medical doctors, X number of nurses, X number of engineers, and so forth and so on. So there is some sort of an arrangement between the provider of the fund and the receiver of the fund. And I think this is really crucial. Yeah. And for performance-based funding, the SLA will outline the financial contribution from the government and the deliverables, as I said again, by the numbers. And the progress of the universities will then be measured according to the agreement that has been entered into by that individual university with the government. And one of the things that we were asked in our very early on town hall discussions and stakeholder consultation is, how many SLAs will be there? So the answer is pretty simple. As many as there are universities in the country or colleges are in the country, because these are individual to the holder, individual to the university. However, we are quite clear that there would be templates that we could use for public and private sector or profit or non-profit universities that will be distinct from one another. But nonetheless, it would be individual to the university, and that agreement is between the university or the college with the government in place. So I'm sure there are many questions later on for SLA. We'll be happy to take the questions at the end of the session. I will be happy to pass this on to Changda. Thank you, Changda.
Thank you, Ross. Just a quick sort of add on to what Ross has talked about on the formula funding. This is not something that our group came up with from nowhere. If you read the blueprint carefully, this is actually has been is the key initiative that is already in the Malaysian education blueprint. It's just that the blueprint has not spelled out exactly how that formula funding is to be executed. And so our team thought this would be a perfect opportunity for us to articulate our thoughts on that. So, in fact,
sorry, Chanda, if I could just add on to that. In fact, we already have a draft or a template for one of the public universities of this funding. I mean, I can't mention the name of the university at this point, but we already have one for a public university, which is pretty good and is drawn out very well. Yeah.
All right. So before I hand over to Mr. Menon to talk about how that all connects to the legal aspect, and one critical aspect that we have also wanted to address was the whole status, the issue of status of academics within the higher education system. Although we have argued that the matters, academic matters, student affairs, and also staff academics affairs should be returned to the hands of the universities to decide for themselves how that needs to be done. But at the system level, in terms of governance, we are suggesting to uphold the status of academics, not just as an employee of the university, but there is actually a higher sort of status that should be respected. And perhaps Mr. Menon can elaborate on that as we go along. And just quickly before we look into that, then what is then going to happen to the public and also the private institutions? So in essentially is going back to where our public university was before, in many aspects. I think in an earlier comment, I think Professor Francis has talked about earlier on the role of the Senate and things like that. So it's returning back to the universities to be able to set up its own internal self-governing structures that has been dismantled by the various changes to our AUKU over the years, especially in 1975 and 1996, and is to restore those essential self-governing structures that allow the public universities to regain its self-governing capabilities. So it's to put in place democratic governance academic systems like the Senate, or even academic boards or council, how you want to name it. But essentially, it's the principle of institutional autonomy must be safeguarded. And the status of the university, and that closely tied to the whole issue of funding, is what is the status of the universities? And our recommendation at the moment is just a statutory body that is controlled. And that's the reason why it falls under Act 605. And so that larger discussion was the funding, change in the funding mechanism should allow the university to redefine the money they receive from the government, not just as an operational funding, but essentially is the revenue that the government is paying to the university for the services the university render to the country, right? And that would change the changes in the definition of funding would then allow the university to be able to say that it generates its own revenue, and hence to redefine that the status of the universities as an independent, financially independent federal statutory body like Bank Negara and some of the statutory bodies that we have in the country, and they do not subscribe into Act 605. And for private institutions, our recommendation was really relatively minor. It's just the need to merge the entity of the company and the university into one single entity. And I will not spend time on that. I will just pass the time to Mr. Menon for him to talk about the third part of how this all connects to the legislation. Mr. Menon, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chang. Just before you leave, or rather you give up your chair, we got to 10:30. I'm sorry, to 11:30, and that gives us time to have a longer question and answer session. I just wanted to remind you because we thought it was 1 hour.
No problem.
Okay, I'm going to go through a few slides of my own, which are an extension to the slides that were presented by Chanda earlier. And I'll be looking primarily at the harmonization of the higher education laws in the country. And I'll be focusing on how we can take the system forward. The initial debate really was whether we should continue to have a higher education system regulated by a ministry, or to actually take away the higher education system, the higher education sector, indeed all education from ministerial hands to a commission. That is, the commission would dictate the policies, it would oversee the monitoring of the institutions, and it would also create an area for development. However, we decided at an early stage that going through the solution of a commission would be too drastic a change. And so we came back to looking at harmonizing the higher education laws. So if I could go to the first slide, and if you look at the present system of higher education, by looking at the way in which they are legally established, you'll find that you have a plethora of laws, a whole mess of arrangements for the establishment, governance, and management of higher education. First, you have the public universities and university colleges, which are regulated by the Universities and University Colleges Act of 1971, which is often described as ORCU, and someone said from the academia when we were consulting them, that ORCU actually sends the cold chill down the back of academics. However, when we looked at the Act and we asked academics what bothered them about the legislation, few were able to indicate what precisely was the concern, and most of the concern that they had was not really the result of the ORCU legislation, but the more vicious legislation that I shall talk about, which we describe as Act 605, which makes academics into civil servants. So you have the Universities and University Colleges Act, which actually has 20 universities under its regulation right now. And these 20 universities are described as the public universities, meaning that, again, according to law, that they are funded, they are established and funded by the government. But the Universities and University Colleges Act does not have just a single method of establishing a university. You have two methods of establishing a university within that legislation. The typical university that you will find established, University of Malaya and all the other universities bearing the names of the states, would go through the normal provisions of the Act, but there is a special provision in the Act which allows for the establishment of universities, public universities, but which are not incorporated by the legislation. And the only example we have now of such a university is the International Islamic University, which had a different history, and it was expected that this university would be funded by an external agency. That did not happen. So despite the fact that they were separated from the other universities established under ORCU, they continue to be funded by the government funding mechanism. Then you have the private colleges and private universities, and these are regulated by Private Higher Educational Institutions Act, often described as Act 555, and you have 100 private universities and university colleges established under that. So you find that the private sector, in terms of the number of universities, has overtaken the number of universities established by the public universities and by the Universities and University Colleges Act. So this inconsistency, or rather, this unexpected development that you would have 100 universities established as private universities against 20 universities, was something which was not anticipated either at the time of the formulation of the 71 Act, or when the Act was amended in 1983, or subsequently when the Private Higher Educational Institutions Act was established in 1996. Then you have all the teacher education colleges, polytechnics, community colleges, and other undefined colleges created or established by the government, and these are established under the Education Act. They don't observe the same governance structure. They have a different governance structure, which is regulated by the Ministry of Education and not by any independent board. In that list of universities that we have, we also have to look at the University Technology Mara, which has its own legislation, and it's surprising why there was a need for a separate legislation when University Technology Mara could have easily been established under the Universities and University Colleges Act. The only difference between only difference one should expect of a university in Malaysia, or a difference between the Mara University and other universities, is simply that it was a university designed only for Bumiputras. But other than that, the university should respond to all the normal criteria of a university and all the internal management and governance structures of a university. But you have a separate university, you have a separate legislation to deal with the University Technology Mara. Then you have the National Defense University of Malaysia, which is again established under the Universities and University Colleges Act, which responds to a military structure in its governance formulation, but it tries to exist under the Universities and University Colleges Act. So here again, you find that sometimes the legislation, or rather sometimes the university established under the principal legislation, is unable to actually exist under the principles, the normal principles associated with the university, but is still considered to be regulated by the legislation that applies to all other universities. Another development, and this, fortunately has not grown in this country, is that you have different ministries wanting to create their own higher educational establishment. The Academy Seni Budaya dan Warisan Nasional, sometimes described as Aswara, is not a university, but it is a college which has degree awarding powers, or it can deal with other institutions to provide a degree to its own graduates. And the Aswara legislation is a legislation that was promoted by the Tourism Board, and you now have an academy which is managed outside the ambit of the Ministry of Education. I've not added there Malaysian Qualification Agencies Act, and you find that the Malaysian Qualification Agency also has its own definition of what a higher educational institution is and what programs it can accredit. And therefore you have a certain degree of looseness, a fragmentation of the concepts within happening through the Malaysian Qualification Agencies Act. So this is the kind of the situation that you're now looking at. And when we talk about harmonization, it is trying to harmonize this really very messy situation insofar as the laws are concerned and the institutions that are established under those laws are concerned. And as I said, there are important issues. There is no conformity in many areas. Can I get the next slide? And it deals with a number of problems. One is that what you see as our higher educational system, the general higher educational system, is that it reflects an ad hoc political approach to the establishment of higher educational institutions that lacks any kind of cohesion, and it works against developing a common strategy to develop higher education. This is as a result, as I said, someone thinks about a new type of institution, an institution serving a new purpose, and an institution is established. The other part about our system is that it is heavily bureaucratized. I think it will be really, idealistic to suggest that in Malaysia, universities are autonomous institutions. I think what you can say at best is that universities are institutions regulated by a bureaucracy established by the Ministry of Education. And this bureaucratization of higher education is something which is very, very entrenched in the system and something which you can't, I think, reform very quickly, as the former minister pointed out. The result of all of this is that there is no flavor of the university as it is traditionally understood. we don't have, I'm not selling the Malaysian system to some foreign notion of a university, but the idea of the university must have some concepts that are traditional, which must have been borrowed and brought into the system, and some traditions which have to be developed locally. We find that we respond to foreign ideas about autonomy and academic freedom. We have not actually looked at the university in the context of, or from the location of the university. We have not looked at how the university could be developed in a different way, adopting traditional concepts, but adapting to new ideas of its own surrounds. The other part about the other criticism about the present system is that it does not set up the supporting of any kind of an academic core of variables, by which this is a phrase which I hate using, but I'm forced to use it. These variables are important. For example, what should the student to faculty ratio be? What should be the goals of the institution? What kind of qualifications should faculty and faculty process? And many other correlations that are necessary to pursue a system of higher education. Only with these core variables can you actually institute institutional development and produce a single brand of higher education, which we can say is a Malaysian brand of higher education. The system also lacks aspirational direction to meet societal needs. There isn't any clear indication that any of the universities in Malaysia have understood its responsibility to the nation. I mean, we talk about unemployability, and that, of course, is a responsibility that the universities have to bear, but a broader responsibility to the needs of its immediate surrounds has also not been taken into account, and is in fact absent in the structure of our universities. There are there's also no single governance model that is applied in all universities. Some universities, as I mentioned, such as UITM, IIU, and the Defense University, just does not fit into the legislative model that they have adapted. And these needs to be rectified. In other words, if you want to bring a standard formulation of a university, not to give up its separate identity, but to have some consistent core values and principles, then obviously we need to look at the legislation again. Insofar as the employment of staff are concerned, you also find that there is a difference between the way in which staff, university staff, are employed in the private sector and university staff are employed in the public sector. In the public sector, I would like to argue, and probably it's a system that you should try to preserve, is that the academic staff enjoy a status. That is, they're not simply, in a relationship of employer and employee or master and servant. They have a status as employees of the university, as academics in the university. And this is an area that one has to push, probably not through legislation, but through academic insistence. But that kind of insistence we have not developed in this country. The present system also discourages collaboration across institutions. We have not established a higher education system which would allow or encourage the collaboration between the different types of systems which we have. So these are some of the criticisms that we had to take into account to look at how we should harmonize them. Yeah. So the proposed solution, and I'll go through this very quickly. I've been given the 5-minute time limit to create a single legislation on higher education, and we named it the Higher Education Act of 2020, and it is almost ready for implementation in January, but the political changes that took place in the following month put that concept or that proposal in cold storage. Then the idea was to create an independent body that will establish the higher education policies and establish principles of funding of public universities. Both these points have been made earlier, but we already have a higher education council, which I'll come to in a while, which is no longer functional. And we thought that any prescription of a buffer body that will oversee the development of policies must have more strength than the present National Council has. The third aspect of this legislative reform was the establishment of an ombudsman. And we meaning in aspect over the last 7 years, we provided pro bono services mainly to university players, staff, students, and others. And we have, we've seen a trend in the kind of complaints that come to us. Staff and academic staff, senior academic staff, complain about the fact that the university itself does not observe its own policy regulations. That there are instances where you have, staff at the end of their wits coming to us and saying, what action can they bring against the university for these things? Now, a legal action would be extremely difficult in such circumstances. But if there was an ombudsman, with a sympathetic ear, then the ombudsman would be able to hear these complaints, take the complaints to the university concerned, and be able to resolve it. But there's another element in the role of the ombudsman. The ombudsman, if properly established, would also create reports on the type of complaints that he receives, that the ombudsman's office receives. And these reports, when published, will give you an indication of where the universities are going. What are the problems that are encountered by universities in the case of students, in the case of staff, and by the institutions themselves. Now, such ombudsman working in other jurisdictions, dealing with other areas of economic activities other than education, have established a whole body of opinion on the way in which the particular institution or the particular service ought to function. In Malaysia, you will find that the Consumers Tribunal has established such a procedure. They receive a number of complaints from the higher education sector, mainly from the private higher education sector, and I think the complaints on education rank number 6 or 7, and the Consumer Tribunal reports would give you an idea as to where the problems with higher education are in terms of students and in terms of parents' interests. Those are the main areas in which we are trying to take the solution forward. The other aspect of the reform of the consolidation was to integrate all higher educational institutions, private and public, within a single legal framework, while retaining the essential purposes of the different institutions and types of institutions. In other words, at one point, there was concern both within the committee that was looking at the reform, as well as with the ministry officials, that we may be touching or putting our fingers or poking on sacred cows that should not be disturbed. Actually, the problem is not on any of these sensitive issues, often described as sensitive issues. The problem really is on structure. And we found that we can absorb institutions like the National Defense University, the Fine Arts Academy, even UITM, all within a single legislation without affecting the diversity that we are now enjoying in the higher education sector. We've also found that the TVET institutions have always been left out of any mainstream reform of education. And what we did was, in the legislation, we incorporated TVET education as a part of higher education in Malaysia. Yeah, and the way in which we decided to introduce some of those core values of a university was not by prescribing it, and we took a different approach. We took what is now described in legal circles as a principle-based approach to putting forward values in any particular system. This has been done in this country with the Personal Data Protection Act, with the recent reform of the corruption legislation, all of which actually attempts to introduce through legislation various principles that the individual institutions are supposed to adopt. So rather than telling them these are the requirements for independence or autonomy, we leave the institutions to determine what those principles are and how they have to be adopted into their system. Now, in doing this, actually, the institutions are not alone. They're not without guidance. There is this document published by the Malaysian Qualifications Agency, and you'll find, for example, in their COPA, the Code of Practice for Program Accreditation, 3 instances they describe of autonomy within the higher education structure. The autonomy of the institution, the autonomy of the departments, the autonomy of staff. And they have a very, very adequate description of what autonomy at all 3 levels ought to be. And that's a minimum statement of autonomy in COPA. So if you state that institutions established as universities or higher educational institutions must respond to those principles, then it is for the individual institutions created under the legislation to establish the incidence of independence and autonomy. Similarly with academic freedom, this is a very difficult concept to identify, but again, as I said, rather than attempting to legally define and prescribe what academic freedom is, we allow the institutions and the people who manage institutions in a collegial fashion to determine these things for their own institutions. So we apply the principle-based approach not only for autonomy and academic freedom, but also we extend it to the institution functioning at a transparent and accountable level in instituting principles that will broaden access. And I have a personal grind here. I think public universities and private universities by nature would broaden access always, but public universities have acted as some kind of protected maidens in this country. They have not gone out to bring in the students. They have not done anything to broaden access. They've been inward looking. Very often it is a very, very selfish inward looking on the part of the universities and university staff. Universities have not done anything to go out into the community to proselytize higher education and to find ways in which the institutions can bring in the students. Our public institutions actually boast that they have high standards and they use high standards to prevent or to reduce access into higher education. I have experiences in 2 other countries, in America and in Australia, and I find that the universities in those countries have developed far more flexible means of entry into higher education than we have done here, although it's a country like Malaysia that needs to broaden access. We also, in these principles, try to articulate the need to respect plurality in our institutions and diversity. In other words, not only in terms of the origins of the institution, meaning not simply because they are foreign branch campuses or that they are non-profit making institutions, but to respect plurality in the type of courses that are offered and in the type of students they introduce into their community and the way in which they recruit staff to work in those institutions. And I think, you know, the universities have not done enough to bring Malaysians together. And finally, although the service is one, you know, universities are supposed to be involved in teaching, in research, and service to the community. I, you know, through working in recent years with a foundation, we found that Indonesian universities, almost every one of them, have a division in the university to work with the community on some project or to encourage the community on some areas of enterprise. So we will add that as, or we added that as one of the principles that universities or higher educational institutions should adopt. Finally, I just want to make this very quick statement that one of the proposals that made by the committee was to restore the regulatory system to its legal formulation. We found that the regulators, the government is sometimes the biggest violator of the laws. We have, you know, even now a regulatory framework that incorporates the National Higher Education Council, which is supposed to oversee policies. We have the minister whose powers are actually prescribed and circumscribed by the legislation. We find that institutions are given powers, and institutions have rights over many of the things that the legislation has provided, but none of these things are really observed. And one of the surprising discoveries we made in the course of our work in 2019 was that the the National Council on Higher Education had not been functional for about 6 years because there was no appointment to the council. And yet it was the council that was given the powers to make policies, and it was the council's policies that had to be observed. So we suggested we've said, in fact, 3 quick solutions, seeing that the entire legislation would take some time to be implemented. We drafted legislation to the level of a bill for the restoration of the National Council on Higher Education, that you need to re-establish that council, that we had to appoint the members in the way in which the legislation prescribed the appointment, and for the council to actually make policies on higher education. My view on that is that, you know, that policies made in the period in which the National Council was dormant are probably policies that are not legal, that can be challenged if someone takes it to court. So one of the recommendations we made, and as I said, I must thank Professor Nick from the Islamic University, Professor Ayman, and others who worked on the legislation, Suhaimi, who worked on the legislation to bring it to the state of a bill, and we presented it to the ministry. The former minister, who you heard earlier, actually put it in motion for it to become law, but it didn't. So these quick changes also included the abolition of Act 605, which will be discussed later. So I will not go into it at the moment. So these changes were what we attempted to do. We formulated a legislation that would establish a single framework for the establishment of all higher educational institutions. We created enough buffer bodies, independent of the government, that would be able to regulate many of the areas that are now under stress in higher education. And I think that's my presentation at this moment. As I mentioned earlier, the abolition of Act 605 is one of these central recommendations that we make. And I will take questions as we go on, because I think I've run out of time.